I guess I'll burst the bubble straight up and saying if there's a war going on, you'd do well to find me in it, not with my bone spurs. But I don't really know if peace is the answer either, and I'll seek to explain that simply by sharing some experience that we've had and some perspectives that we've garnered across the way as EGGS has tried to step through these very, very difficult issues. Activism is the hook in the title, and I will address it, but I won't speak of activism for very long. However, I will make a few comments to satisfy everyone's curiosity. And I should say I do have some slides for your entertainment. Nothing heavy, won't give you indigestion. Just a few pretty pictures to keep the flow going. So, on activism, a much discussed topic currently. It seems to be the centre of the attention of many. Firstly, I think it's important, language is important. We've got to define these things and be clear about what we're talking about. So what's activism? The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the trespass, the imagery, what's being put forward in the media. And that's driving our conversations, I think, as a sector, as to what activism is. But of course, activism is a much broader concept. It's any activity to drive change in social change or politics. And it's not necessarily a dirty word. I'd remind everyone of that. There's lots of nice activists out there. I think Nelson Mandela was an activist and he's generally considered a pretty good bloke. So what are we actually focusing on when we talk about activists? And I think it's really people that are acting irresponsibly in pursuit of their interests, their beliefs, their cause. There's a very pointy end of that, and it is the trespass piece that we see so much about in the media. There are other aspects that we talk about and are made aware of regularly, and that's campaign activity which almost inherently involves false and misleading information to misrepresent the agriculture sector and drive a perspective. And then below that, you might call it, if you like, reasonable activism, or at least neutral activism. People that have a perspective in relation to the agriculture sector, particularly the use of animals, and they're questioning the current use of animals and ultimately driving a perspective that animals should be treated better, including in farming systems. Now, I say that's reasonable not because I agree with that perspective, but in the end, we need to be respectful of all perspectives. If we want to have our perspectives respected, then we need to respect those of others. And for anyone that's quietly putting that forward, or even loudly, I think it is a relevant perspective and not one to be dismissed or be the source of great frustration or anger. But what are we focusing on at the moment? What we're focusing on is activists that are invading farms. And that's certainly, when people are starting conversations with me on this topic, that's the problem. And I think that's enormously natural and forgivable, if you like, because I personally find something very scary about it. They're at the gate. They have a physical presence on farm. I know farmers that are affected by this. I know farmers that have families and their children on farm. And I would find it enormously intimidating if you had groups of people, including large groups of people, declaring that they are justified in entering your premises. And of course, they do it in circumstances where it's not just about the entry and a good day out, it's about gathering information, often put forward on a misleading basis, and making it part of a claim that that farmer and farmers in general are doing the wrong thing and shouldn't be supported by our community in the work that they do. Now, that is enormously concerning. It's concerning to me. But what I'm going to put forward is a perspective that does deserve focus, but it should not be taking all of our focus. And in fact, there's probably a broader main game that we do need to be focusing on. I'll make a brief reference of trespass laws, which were mentioned in Karen's introduction. I would say these laws are, in general terms, appropriate and even important. If it's important to have quiet possession of your property and the deterrents are not effective, then we can increase those deterrents, and that's a reasonable response. I think some of the work that's being done at a federal level, I think with that constitutional hook to the use of a carriage service, makes good sense if people are going to sit back and try and harness the energy of others and drive scores of people onto farms. That's inappropriate in my view, and it shouldn't happen, and that makes good sense. Recently I saw New South Wales came out with some, I'm not sure if they've passed these laws yet or are just proposing them, but the nuisance laws, if they're going to be vexatious claims in relation to really the standard operation of a farm to try and obstruct that, then it makes good sense that should be prevented from happening. The difficulty that I have and the perspective that I bring is that those laws really are focused on what they're focused on, generally trespass. And they're not going to do anything to solve the broader issue in relation to campaign organisations, pushing forward their perspective, including with respect to use of false and misleading information against the agriculture sector. And I see that as the primary threat. Not the primary threat to an individual that happens to have someone at the gate, I get that, but in terms of leaders of our sector who are really trying to together chart a course over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I really do think the main game is this battle of ideas as to the way in which we should use animals, the way in which we should farm, the way in which we should feed our community. And my perspective is that's where the energy should be going. Before I move on, I just note this photo. I guess I wanted to display activism, and I got onto Google and I found something contemporary. And here we have I think it was from the Queensland raids. I chose this one because people weren't too close up. I didn't want to focus on any particular individual. But as I prepared further, I kept reflecting back on it. And at one point I just noticed, who are these activists? And if you look closely, they're really just a bunch of kids in that photo. Like, they could be taken out of any university, that I was in 20 years ago. And you can see they've donned their nice biosecurity gear and they're there for what appears to be a day out. In that sense, I sort of feel like a great part of the problem as we see it with respect to trespass is that members of our community, of which if they are just a bunch of kids, that's what they are, they're just members of our community, are being caught up with a set of ideas which I'd question. And looked at it in that way, I would suggest that they're hard to hate, or they should be hard to hate, and that we should be changing our focus to the most productive area of engaging more broadly with the community. And the final thing I noticed on this slide, which was only this morning, is that if you look at this young girl on the right-hand side there, through her translucent biosecurity suit, she's wearing pink short shorts. And I put it to you, if you want to go to war with someone and they're wearing pink short shorts, you're probably on the wrong side of the issue. Now, I'd like to share a perspective based on our experience as I've flagged. But we didn't start at the end. We had to learn and traipse our way through it. And we certainly didn't get it right the first time. So our first attempt as an industry, and this was before I arrived, but I certainly don't make this point with any judgment whatsoever, because, by the way, everyone did it, and they did it for about 2 decades. And I'm absolutely sure that if I was involved in the sector at that time, I would have been doing the same thing. But with issues put to agricultural industries to suggest that they're doing the wrong thing, the very natural response, rational response, logical response is to defend yourself. And that's precisely what the sector has done for a very long time. And the egg industry did it in spades. And of course it's reactionary. The issue's put to you, you're doing the wrong thing, and you hit back and say, no, you're not, we're doing the right thing. And there's a problem with that. It doesn't work, ultimately. And I think that's the long-run, well-tested experiment, certainly that the egg industry has undertaken, and I believe other sectors have proven the point very well at all. Because the problem with being defensive is, of course, you look defensive, and you're really playing a part in, a media moment, really. It's a bit of a play, and there's a casting couch, and there's a villain required, and you fit into it quite neatly. And I think the ultimate outcome of defending yourself in that way is to validate, at least to some extent, the concerns that have been raised against you. So I think ultimately it makes it worse, not better. And I make that point in circumstances where I think we're all to be forgiven for taking that approach at first instance. So when I arrived in the egg industry, I had seen this happening for a little while, and it wasn't hard to get in conversations around the place with people who would acknowledge this perspective. It wasn't the right thing to do. We shouldn't be doing it. And I thought, well, what are we going to do? Well, first things first, I didn't know. So we just stopped doing anything at all in terms of messaging and reacting to this. And that, if you go and check the records, you'll find we went pretty quiet for a little while. And that was really an attempt to learn, research, and look into it and not make it worse along the way, because the part that we were playing was, at that time, we felt enormously counterproductive. The opposite, of course, of defence is offence. I don't like to be offensive. I get confused by the use of that term. But being proactive, of course, is something we can all agree with. And what we ultimately decided to do was that we needed to be front-footed and show leadership in relation to these issues that were being prosecuted against us and others. And that's a very confusing place, because you say, okay, I'm going to lead and I'm going to be front-footed, and you have to confront the question on day one, well, what is it you're going to say and what is it that you're going to do? So I'll step through the logic. The first was, well, who are we going to talk to? So previously activists have been talking to us, and we'd been, if you like, talking back to them, generally through the media, not really appreciating or realising that it was the community that was hearing us and that they weren't hearing what we wanted them to hear. But important decision point, who are you going to talk to? You want to make the world better, you want to progress your issues. And you've got a choice of audiences. One is to talk to one another. There's a bit of that going on, and of course there still is, putting out messages that as a sector we like to hear and that make us feel that our voice is being heard. The problem with that is that the people that are already on board preaching to the converted, they hear it, and others don't hear it in the way that you want them to. So it's not very productive. There is a school of thought that you ought to be talking to the activists, that you should sit down with them and somehow share your reasonableness of your position. They'll see the light, or some variation of that, and you'll make some form of agreement as to a way forward. My perspective is you should be talking to anyone that will talk to you. I would never suggest you shouldn't talk to anyone, including you shouldn't talk to activists. I think they're part of the community. They're just a pointy end. But if that's your strategy, to sit down and talk to them, I really just don't believe that's going to work. They're enormously committed, principled. Frankly, they're making money out of it. They've got business models that are put around it. It's just futile, I think. And as I say, talk to them if you can, but if you only had $10 in 10 minutes, I don't think it's the best use of your time. So who should you be talking to? Which target audience should you be focusing on? Really I believe, and we learnt and we decided, we should be focusing on that audience that they're focusing on, which is the broader community. And there's challenges with that, and I'll get to it, but they're the ones that ultimately are going to decide the outcome of the egg industry, the outcome of the agriculture sector. And that's what we want. We want better outcomes, and we want a progressive perspective that will lead to those outcomes. Once you've decided who you want to talk to, you get another important decision point. What are you going to say? And this is enormously difficult because, again, just like being defensive, there's incredible temptation of logic and rationality and human nature. And just tell them is, of course, the feedback that you get, as if that will be productive and they will understand. But it doesn't really work that way. And conventional PR, which, by the way, I'm not a PR trained person, I don't really understand. Where you stay on message and you tend towards your benefits and what's good about your industry. Yeah, I can't see how that is going to work, and I certainly think it's been proven that it doesn't work in this context. If there is an issue where it's the way in which animals are treated or environmental issue, you've got to stay relevant and you've got to be speaking to that issue and talking about the wonderful impact you have on employment or supporting Aboriginal communities isn't going to cut through with a community that either has itself a concern or has had a concern raised with it by someone else on a particular issue. So we meet this fellow. I don't know if you've heard or seen him before, but I like this guy. His name's Peter Sandman, and he is a crisis management expert and professor in the United States. He applies a discipline which is distinct from this issue. It relates to crisis management. We're talking sort of oil spills or, chemical poisoning of the river. But he brings a really important perspective and something I certainly learn a lot from, and that's the way in which the community thinks. So firstly, he drives a community focus and the psychology of the community, and then the way in which they hear messages, and creates a very clear distinction in my mind, and I think in anyone's who adopts this perspective, of how a message is going to land with your target audience. And that drives a complete change in focus. So you stop talking about what you want and what you want to achieve, and you start thinking about it from your audience's point of view. What are they interested in? What do they want? And in very general terms, our communities, who, by the way, eat all the food that we produce, are vulnerable in a sense. They don't know precisely, because they're disconnected from the agriculture sector, what's going on behind the curtain, if you like. And they're trusting, or we hope they are, that people are acting appropriately behind that curtain. And that's a source of concern and, a mild anxiety, if you like. And really, you need to take that on board in framing the communications and the way in which you reach out to them. If you're speaking to that concern, you're much more likely to be heard and to have your perspective cut through. There's a problem with that, and it's a problem we've put to me many, many times in the last few years, and that is that it simply can't be done because the community's out there and we're in here, and there's too many of them and we don't have the money. So I had to tackle that one too, and I looked at various community engagement processes. What are people up to? What are they doing? What's working? And what became apparent is that in other sectors, there was expertise available for community engagement, which was quite different in that it was highly representative and broad scale, and it allowed, through relatively inexpensive means, the ability to access the community at large. That very thing that, you'll find myself in conversations and being told that couldn't be done. And of course we do that through very basic means. We've got census data, we know where these people are. There's this enormous body of people that are prepared to do surveys in this country, including for money. And survey companies are able to access them. And so here we have the dots on the page from our process, which I'll speak of in a second, which is our sustainability framework, where we've got the CSIRO to do a national survey. And the dots on the page is just where people live, and it's possible to identify them by broad demographics of geography, age and gender, and get a good profile of the community at large. And of course, from that, it's possible to access them and to engage with them. Further, we borrowed, I didn't come up with it, we borrowed the logic that had been applied in other sectors, including the mining sector by the CSIRO, which borrowed the logic of the Peter Sandmans of going to people first, and said, well, how do you do this? Well, firstly, you steer well away from traditional sort of market research, vox pop type surveys. We say, what do you think about an issue? And you get from that a very large amount of context bundled up in a singular answer, usually driven by the way in which the question's asked. And I can assure you, whatever it is that you're interested in, I can deliver you a survey, in a month or two that gives you the answer that you want. And it wouldn't even be that obvious, because with such subtlety, you can direct people towards these answers. And you get these surveys, and it finds that 95% of people think X. Well, that's because 95% of people read the question, and the question directed you squarely towards X. So social science is effectively the opposite of that. I don't even know if it's that much more complicated, but it's importantly more sophisticated. It asks the questions from a range of different angles, many of which are validated questions that have been asked in many other contexts, and it is able to see through that richness of data points, to see through an issue and get a much more robust landing on what people think about it than a singular question that is vulnerable to the way in which it's drafted. So we're stepping through it. We know who we want to talk to. We know that we want to focus on what they want. We've got available expertise to do it. And I make the point that, we're a pretty small industry relative to the sector, and certainly a small RDC. It's well within the budgets of an RDC to conduct this work. And off we went, and we built a process around that. Very quickly, there was a 3-year process, sustainability framework. We did an enormous amount of work that there isn't time to go into today, engaging with our farmers, explaining it in detail, and ensuring that it had their buy-in. It couldn't be a bunch of peak bodies off on a frolic. Survey conducted on a fully transparent basis. I can't emphasise that enough, I guess. I don't know that I've seen others doing that. That was a massive gulp moment, and it's something that was the subject of much discussion by the industry, that we should lay ourselves bare and do it on a basis of independent parties going to do this and we're going to publish the results. And what was the point of that? We're trying to demonstrate transparency, genuine transparency, and I think we did that. So the results came in October, and then we, as an organisation, Australian Eggs, led the response to it, and we put out a report responding to the issues that were raised by the community in February, and we launched into the second phase. Now, the survey closes today. If anyone wants to participate, I reckon you can still get on the CSIRO website and do so, and we encourage you to do so. We did it on a representative basis and an open sample basis, so anyone on the open sample could go to the website and tune in and conduct the survey, but also we got a lock on that representative data set that the CSIRO had access to. Now, the results are very, very insightful. They're hidden in plain view on our website, I do come across people very regularly who are enormously interested in this issue and want to engage on it and want to discuss it. And I do ask, oh, and have you read it? And they go, no. And I just suggest, if you are genuinely interested in it, please go and have a look. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. I could talk for weeks on the various insights available, but I've included just one here, which in a sense assists in validating the point I've made earlier about where we should be focusing. On the first survey, it was promoted by the RSPCA, and we ended up with a vastly increased number of respondents to the open sample, so over 8,000. In doing so, we sort of, in a way, captured the RSPCA database perspective. And it makes a really interesting contrast. And the statistician that was involved with the CSIRO was very excited about this graph because he said the distributions were just perfect. So you have the representative sample with a perfect bell distribution as to whether matters concerning animal welfare are a matter of principle to them. And for the others, in the open sample, you have this spike with the majority, it would seem, up there at number 7 saying, no, these are matters of principle to me. And I think that really is telling as to the capacity that we have as agricultural industry to change people's minds. Your bell curve is going to be open. People that are declaring it a matter of principle are not going to be open. In addition to a range of insights, we ended up with the heart of the process, which was the recipe for success. What do we want to do in the end? We want to build trust. We want the community to trust us and to accept us. And the whole process and the science of it is built around that. And they delivered it. So as you can see, the drivers of trust for our industry is the extent to which we're well regulated, the extent to which we're responsive, and the extent to which our benefits outweigh the costs. Those little numbers there are scientific magic, but they are weighted, so you can see that the greatest driver at 0.36 of trust for our industry is the extent to which we are responsive to community concerns. Now, that was enormously valuable. Many would say that's a duh moment, like what did you expect? And in a sense I could have guessed at it because there's an intuition to it. But this slide has changed the nature of the conversations that we have as an industry. It basically goes on the wall, and what we want and what we think and what we surmise as to what other people are doing is referable to, well, how is that going to demonstrate that what we're doing is responsive to community expectations? And for someone who's trying to assist the industry drive its sustainability and tackle these issues, that's an enormous benefit just from the start. And of course, we're just warming up. The thing about the process that we've undertaken is that it's borrowed from the mining sector. It has a generic application to it. And I believe, we'll see how it goes, and I could be proven wrong, but I believe it's capable of being adopted in a very broad range of sectors, including each of the agriculture industries. And that has been the conversation that's been taking place for the last 18 months. Is there something we can do collectively in recognition that these issues are cross-sector, that one impacts the other? What can we do collectively to progress this? And I'm thrilled that there is a project underway. In fact, it's sort of just started after a lot of talking and getting organised. It's got a group of RDCs, and I haven't had time to update the slide, but LiveCorp has joined the group, and I apologise for the logo being missing, but also the NFF, joining together to try and progress the issue of community trust at a sector-wide level. It won't go to those granular issues that take place in each sector. It won't go to solving an issue in relation to glyphosate, or caged eggs or any other specific issue. It's going to almost act as a demo model as to how these processes pan out and demonstrate the value that they can deliver to each industry. I don't think we can tell each other what to do, but we can show each other what to do. I should say it's already working because the conversations that have happened in the lead up to this point to get this project off the ground have really stimulated a lot of activity. And I think the grains industry has just implemented a sustainability framework. I know that the West Australian DPI is doing something similar or connected. I don't have the details. New South Wales DPI is either joining the process or doing something in parallel. And so we have this really important coming together of perspectives to work on what I think is the most productive thing we can do. Time will tell as to whether we can get there, but there's certainly green shoots to demonstrate that we're on the right track. I'll just make a few comments on, I guess, where to from here, and that really involves the obstacles, if you like, that might get in the way or what we need to overcome. And the first relates to transparency. I'll just quickly note that it's just such a variously used term. So we know transparency is important. People are raiding farms because of alleged lack of transparency, and we need to respond to that. But my observation is everybody's using it in different ways at the moment. There's big T transparency. You might show full transparency. There's small T transparency, where you might just show the things that you want to show. And I think we need to drive a greater commonality with respect, and quite frankly, a greater level of transparency across the sector, where we're prepared to be open, to own our impacts, and to demonstrate to the community that we don't have anything to hide. And that's going to be a process of bringing people on board. Another potential obstacle is our culture as a sector. And that's important because it's unfortunate, but one of the aspects of this is you don't have to get a few industry leaders involved in these processes. You actually get to get everybody involved. And that's always challenging because there will always be people that don't want to get on the trust train, don't see it that way. And I think the way in which we interact with one another, the way in which we interact with activists, the way in which we interact with the community is deeply embedded in our history as a sector and our culture that has arrived as a result of that history. I've got the turtle here. I'll just explain the muscle memory. If you've ever got a little turtle and you turn them around, they very quickly flip their way back and head for the sea. And that was my experience in engaging with egg farmers. Certainly not all of them, but certainly some of them. You could demonstrate the logic of the process and the benefit to them and the benefit to their business, but it wouldn't be too long for some of them before they would start flipping back to, old ways and the way in which they would prefer the world to be. And I think calling that out and ensuring that everyone's tackling it will accelerate the process. Finally, a little bit of expectations management. Hard things are hard. Some might have seen that before. That was on Barack Obama's desk when he realised that it wasn't as easy as he thought it would be before he got the job. Hard things are hard. Look, I see this as an enormous challenge for our industry and this sector. I see it as a minimum as a decadal process, probably a couple of decades, to get our heads around it, to get momentum. All the green shoots in the world are fantastic, but it's going to take a long time to change the way in which we operate and change the way in which we engage with the community and start to get real results. And if we manage our expectations in that context, we're much more likely to get there because it is human nature to want quick results and to declare a process is just not working at all, is hopeless and should be binned. And I would say, no, strap yourself in, it's going to be a long ride.